Nobody gets to see how the sausage is made. Local Motors is like, no, we're not only going to show you how the sausage is made, you're going to help make the sausage with us.
Paid off
Absolutely.
for Local Motors.
It did. It did for many years.
Yeah, and that's why we were able to create products that got out there to the world.
What exactly is the downside of being a platform that raises other people to levels of success they might not have seen otherwise?
You're going to get all kinds of designs that solve problems that you didn't even know could be solved potentially.
When they worked with BMW or Shell or Domino's,
the smartest designers and engineers probably don't work for your company.
There's been entire companies that came from people who didn't win challenges that took their innovations elsewhere.
And it's going to be about the community, because that's the goose that lays the golden eggs, right?
I've still been very passionate about the idea that co-creation is a power and force for good. So I'm David Scott Neal, and everyone knows me as Nemo, which is a fun story. Basically, I got started through getting an opportunity to join the team at Local Motors. And Local Motors was a bit of a pioneer in the co-creation world when they started their online community in 2008. They started running these like locally themed design challenges, and they would leverage the power of the crowd, and they would openly collaborate during those challenges. So it wasn't a black box thing. People could see what everyone else was working on. They would discuss it. They would critique it while it was going on. I participated in that community, and then when they gave me the job in 2014, I went from participating to managing that co-creation community.
Nemo,
as
real
such,
quick,
I got this.
What kinds of projects were they? Like what kinds of?
Mostly automotive, but when they partnered with other OEMs, they tend to be more like experientially based. Like when they worked with BMW or Shell or Domino's, rather than being strictly physical product focused, it was around like with Shell, it was more about like how do you deal with the climate activism aspect of mobility, right? And with BMW, it was about how can we enhance safety and experience in cars, and with Domino's is about the ultimate delivery vehicle and what does that mean, right? So while it was all centered around automotive, it wasn't specific about the car itself. It was around what aspect of the ecosystem around the car can co-creation improve. It became a vital aspect of how Local Motors would innovate. Would work with other companies to innovate on their behalf. And when I joined in 2014, one thing they were doing was white labeling the function of co-creation, but they weren't sure how to codify it. And that's actually where I met Chris. And so that's a good segue into letting Chris take over.
Yeah, so my background is the creative process. And so by the time I got to Local Motors, I'd already been teaching. I wrote my thesis on the creative process, and I was really interested in putting a lot of that stuff to work. And so co-creation was really interesting because it was the creative process by other means, and I hadn't seen it used that way before. And so a lot of what I did was ask Nemo how to do stuff and then apply my own theoretical background to what we were doing to try to encourage the community, get conversations going, and just make sure that smart people and people who had cool points of view were being heard in the process. And then of course just setting it up as the co-creation brand manager, which is why I talked to Nemo so much. I think I drove to Chandler, where his office was, probably daily for a while there, to just pick Nemo's brain and get him tell me make decisions, because we were on deadlines and we need to get stuff done. It was awesome partnership.
Nice. And so, guys,
Oliver,
tell me, what is co-creation?
Oh.
Because I'm a little confused about what co-creation is. Could we explain to people who don't know what that is? What is it exactly?
You want to take this one first, Chris?
Well, I thought you could take it first, and then I would
All right.
summarize and critique. No, I'm just kidding.
No, you know what? That's actually a fair way of approaching it, I think.
Let's go.
I could be very long-winded on this one, so I'll try to keep it nice and short. Basically, co-creation is any time that you have various different viewpoints that are allowed to have participation in a development of a creative project or a product development kind of strategy. So you would start with, in our case, we use the online community, so crowdsourcing, which is a function of co-creation, but it was kind of the function that Local Motors leveraged to do co-creation. And we were using tons of different types of people online to do it. So we had engineers, we had designers, we had makers, we had people that are more or less just, hackers. Just any walk of life that felt like they had something to offer, we welcomed all comers. And as such, we were able to get such diverse thoughts and opinions and expertise that we were able to see the bigger picture of some of the creative initiatives that we put out there to the zeitgeist. And I think that's where the power of co-creation, from my experience, comes from, is those diverse voices all have the ability to participate in the process, which typically, especially in automotive, which is where we started doing this, is a black box product development process, right? Nobody gets to see how the sausage is made. Local Motors is like, no, we're not only going to show you how the sausage is made, you're going to help make the sausage with us. And that was our version of co-creation. As such, I would say that my attitudes have matured to where there are various different levels of co-creation, to which we'll probably unpack in this interview. But you have kind of subcategories where it's still the online community, right? You still see that pretty alive today in various platforms like Discord. And then you also have professional co-creation, where businesses that have no business working together, or that you would never think to pair together, are able to come together and create some really cool, diverse ideas and products and innovations. And there's more to it. And like I said, we'll unpack that later.
Yeah, I think one of the things when you first hear about co-creation is like, oh, you just throw some idea out to the community and ask for suggestions, right? And then you have a ton of noise come in because everybody's like, every joker with their, ideas out there just throwing them at you. What's fundamental, I think, to co-creation is structure and brief. And so what we did was we created a closed solution space, which goes to my research, right? Immediately when I got to Local Motors, I'm like, yes, this makes sense, because you're creating a solution space, and now you're saying, here are the requirements, and it's real world. And that's why we were able to create products that got out there to the world, and we're able to crowdsource. Is because it wasn't disorganized. There was structure to it. There was a problem statement, and then there was a community that was able to team up with small teams, so there aren't too many cooks in the kitchen, with everybody contributing to one idea, right? And so it actually worked because you had these groups of people. You had a really tight solution space by virtue of the brief. For instance, a challenge. So like a challenge organizes thinking around a brief. So the Airbus challenge, Nemo, you remember that? So
yes, I do. So
we worked with Airbus, and Airbus wanted a drone, right? I'm not going to go into the details, but they wanted a drone. And so, but they had specs that it had to meet, and those specs made sense. And that's the other thing too, is you have to know how to brief it so that it's not just a whole list of things that you want to have that are too much for anybody to keep inside their head, right? Too like, why do we have this spec, right? So it all makes sense. So there's an art to it and a science to it, a human aspect to it. And then we said, okay, there's going to be I think the way we structured that one is a first, second, third, chosen by subject matter experts and leaders. And then there was a first, second, third that were, that the crowd actually, like the teams voted on the best ideas, best designs. And so that's, all of a sudden the community feels very involved and invested and clear on what they're actually doing. And so
Absolutely.
I think those are key factors.
So what did the community actually contribute that you think Local Motors could not have produced on its own? Do you think that if Local Motors had been able to, would have been able to have done what you achieved through co-creation on its own? If not, why not?
I give you a quote, Nemo. Do you remember Jay Rogers? He would always say the best people, the smartest designers and engineers probably don't work for your company, right?
Yep, I remember that one. Yeah. And so what you're able to do is when you have these siloed product development teams, right? Your engineers, your designers, your product managers and stuff like that, you create, by nature of them being siloed, you create echo chambers, right? And eventually, even if you have dissenting voices within the team, eventually it kind of is a regression toward the means. Everybody marches to the beat of the same drum eventually, and then you wind up with a product. Now, that's not to say that you can't make good products that way. Obviously, you can, because that's how product development has been done for hundreds of years before that.
Nemo, can I ask a question? You're clarifying regression toward the mean. We tend toward average ideas that have been done before, with very little, like very incremental improvements, but not vast improvements, not a fundamental.
And the regression to the means is constraint driven, right? Because that's budget driven, that's schedule driven, and that's scope driven, right? And so what happens is you get into risk mitigation mode rather than innovation mode.
Trying to move toward the sure thing rather than rethinking it.
Absolutely. What co-creation does is says we can add more voices through these, as you said, controlled means, and through these various different functions and mechanisms that kind of manages the chaos of all those voices. Still maintain schedule, still maintain budget. Scope, we'll see. Because what bubbles out of the community helps determine scope. And then we still have a mitigation effort. But now we have one mitigation effort instead of all three.
Can you explain that a little bit? That the scope, you said it comes from the community. What do you mean by that, and how does that affect an actual project?
So when we were in design challenges, quite often the winner of the challenge, usually selected by a jury of experts and with some influence from the community in the down select process, that was what product we were to some degree committed to create. Obviously, some challenges were for the sake of doing some cool innovation and thought, and there was no product that would come from it. But in some cases, there were products that came from it, like this little guy right here. Right, that's a product of co-creation right there. You see where I'm pointing. So the idea there is the diverse voices that were involved in the process of coming up with those innovations wouldn't have happened because they were completely independent from any of the constraints that stopped those voices from coming internally, right? They didn't operate under the same constraints. And so they're free to explore.
So what you're saying is that in order to run a successful co-creation platform, you can't make this promise like, hey, we're going to do this, everybody join in, and then in the end, you don't make anything, right? So you kind of have to make things.
But that's all dictated going back to what you first said, and I entirely agree that it has to come from the brief. The brief has to be robust enough that it's not only creating what you expect people to take on with regard to challenge, what problems are they solving, but it also sets up the preliminary draft of your evaluation criteria to evaluate the ideas that come later with no anticipation of what those ideas may or may not look like. Right? So by having a really good brief, you set yourself up for success on various different levels of the co-creation brief. You know how you're going to critique the ideas that come to you. You know how you're going to evaluate and choose the ideas that come to you. And at the end, it helps mitigate the scope based on what you choose.
Yeah, because you can't really just tell a community and expect them to be creative when you're saying like, oh, and it has to be within this budget, and now they have to go out and like create a bill of material for their design, it's too much of a burden.
You can give shadows of that and say, hey, we're not going for the most expensive components. It is a budget-driven process, so be budget-minded. But we're going to do that work anyways. We still want innovative ideas. And what's interesting is, especially when dealing with engineers and designers, they're so used to working within frameworks of scheduling and budget that they do it second nature anyways. Right? Especially the ones that we had the opportunity and absolute joy to work with within our community. Some of the most talented people we've ever had the opportunity to work with came from the community, and we're still in contact with them, and we're still, acquaintances to this day. And this is almost 20 years from the genesis of co-creation as far as Local Motors is concerned.
So Nemo, you said, hey, when we don't know exactly what's going to come out of it, which is the whole point. That's the whole value, right? Because you're going to get all kinds of designs that solve problems that you didn't even know could be solved potentially. And they might not even be in the winning team. They might not even be the winning product. You also, in a co-creation community, you get access to these people. You just said, you still keep in contact with people today. Like, I'm still LinkedIn connected with people, and if I talk to them, we'd have a good conversation. We'd pick up right where we left off. So talent, you don't really get that when you're trying to, like on YouTube, right? You don't get access to those things. And so there are all kinds of externalities, I guess, from this process that benefit the company. Now, Nemo, they can't keep it secret though, right? Like in a co-creation community, Airbus, they couldn't just be like, okay, now nobody tell anybody about all the problems we solved and all the products. So that's kind of a cost, right, to co-creation?
Yeah. The security risk aspect when working with the larger companies was always a question. And so what we had to do is we had to go through these different efforts where you had to separate out what was proprietary and potentially a risk to share, because you don't want your competitors knowing it and stuff like that, and what was willing to be open and stuff to kind of brag about the nature of the innovation, right? Which is the point. It changed the culture of some of the companies that we worked with, in that they thought that it all had to be like quiet and in that black box and secretive, when they realized sharing and having these collaborative, challenges and seeing how the people worked with each other in community, and then how they were able to work with Airbus post-selection of the winner, which was called the Velator, right? That whole process opened their eyes to there are better ways of doing these things. And so it even changed aspects of the culture internally on how they do those things. Not everything needs to be black box, right? There is some aspects of things that can be public that they can draw value from outside voices on, and be able to innovate. And so from just using that as an analog, right? The Airbus, there's still a lot of proprietary things that they have to do, especially with some of the more regulatory hurdles that they have to deal with. But at the same time, the idea of co-creation and collaboration is seen through a different lens just from that exposure. Right?
Well, and even then, it's not like Airbus had to share anything proprietary in that challenge. I'm not aware of anything they're like, hey, we need design around this particular super secret thing that we're trying to,
right.
Like, you don't need to do that.
Not on the initial brief in the ignition kit,
right?
Which by Oliver, for context, ignition kit was a list, like the brief, a list of deliverables, but it was also assets we were willing to give to the community that helped them formulate their design. So sometimes it would be CAD, sometimes it would be design templates, things like that. In the case of Airbus, what it was a bunch of envelopes of space of where the motors could go, the wingspan, the height, the storage capacity. These were envelopes right? So if you're a Formula One guy, you kind of understand that in the rule set, you have all those envelopes of space that they allow for rules. We did the same thing in co-creation. So in that, they didn't give away a lot in the ignition kit. You're correct, Chris, right? It was just those envelopes and a really good hefty list of deliverables, which is smart, right? The thing is, though, is in the midst of the innovation that happens in co-creation, there is still risk of exposure that what is created within that sort of pantheon of ideas is now proprietary to Airbus because that's the things they're looking to option. Guess who else sees that? Any one of their competitors. And so there's still a level of risk that they were interested in. But the thing is all it says is what those innovations are, not how you choose to achieve them. Right? And that was kind of our spin towards, like, not just with Airbus, of course, but with other companies that we had worked with. This is like, yeah. It says what the feature is. Like, Nico DePire could tell you just tons of stories about how the UDV situation went down with Domino's. He was actively and heavily working on that. I was on the community, so I didn't get the opportunity to work on that. But some of his stories talk about things like being that it was more marketing driven, you want people to know that these are the innovations, but you don't tell them how you do them, right? Those things can be just as powerful both from a marketing and a product development standpoint as if you try to black box it and keep it secret up until you launch it, you know?
I wonder what happens to stock price when you start coming out with these things that you may or may not make, but everyone's just like, what is going on over there?
I honestly haven't thought to put a correlation to publicly viewed co-creation versus stock price, because we did work with a few different publicly traded community companies with the community. Peterbilt being one of them, right?
GE.
GE. Well, GE on a number of capacities because we did the FirstBuild.
Right.
We did GE Fuse, and then there was
which
one
was
other
their
one
own co-creation. We stood up their co-creation platform.
where we white labeled. Correct. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The other thing too that strikes me is there's always this idea whenever I talk to people with an idea, they're like, don't tell anybody, like don't even tell your friends because everybody will steal this idea. And then
the friend DA. It's not an NDA, it's a friend DA.
That's friend DA. But I mean, but the whole point being like, probably people aren't in a position to steal your idea. They're probably working on other things anyway. And if you're poised as a company to do that,
I have a better theory on that, but I'll let you.
Okay, yeah, and then you can build give us your better theory. But if you're poised to do that already, you're gonna be the first mover. Pretty much, period, right? I mean, those other companies don't have unlimited budget. They're not just like not doing anything, waiting for you to innovate so they can copy it, right? Maybe our friends overseas might be, but
it proves our friends overseas and the nature that they have for some products copied, right? Actually proves your thesis there, and I want to build off of that. The way I explained it is, upon joining the team at Mosey, there was a sense that we, working with a bunch of software engineers, they're used to being siloed. They're used to having, even from separate teams. Like one team doesn't interact with this team until there's the integration effort, and they do not talk to each other within certain organizations. And that's pretty standard practice. Whereas I come on board and I'm just like, I want to talk openly about what we're doing, and I want to show openly about what we're doing. And they're like, why would you do that? What if someone copies us? And I'm like, what they're copying is a visual snapshot of the thing with some small explanation to support it. They don't understand all the documentation and ideation and engineering and effort that goes behind it. So the burden of them to execute that before us is even higher because they don't have all that other context and inspiration to support the idea in the first place. And if they're successful with executing a version of the idea, all it does is validate the original idea, which is going to be executed better because it has more robust sort of backfilling. We're 10 steps ahead of them anyways.
Well, and we own the relationship.
Correct.
You own the relationship with the designers who originally came up with it, who probably have other
Absolutely.
tangential ideas, which puts even further ahead.
Absolutely. And so let them copy, right? The what is the real quote? It's like copying is the sincerest form of flattery is the one that everyone knows, right?
Yeah.
Imitation is sincere. Well,
Right.
really what it is imitation is the sincerest form of flattery that mediocrity can pay to greatness. Let them copy. Let them be mediocre and pay homage to my greatness. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
if more people had that attitude, they wouldn't silo their ideas so hard and be afraid of sharing them. The idea that ideas are precious, especially in modern time with things like AI, which co-creation, by the way, kind of exposed this sort of fallacy. Ideas are cheap, right? The commerce of ideas is very, very cheap. It's the execution that provides value to the idea. And an idea rarely is perfect upon conception. Another potential benefit of co-creation is being able to be the crucible in which those ideas become much more crystallized, rather than them being this nebulous thing where, oh, I got this $1 million idea, right? Every guy I've ever sat down and had a beer with has $1 million ideas.
Right.
How much execution and what, like how many of them were actually like tested and hardened and created things?
Well,
That's a funnel.
Yeah, and I think so. In the creative process, the creativity, we have another innovation. There's another issue, and it's like we need the right idea at the right time, and so we need people who can have ideas. So even before you execute, there's a principle of like you have to be able to innovate from a problem, not just like, oh, hey, I saw this thing, I'm drinking a beer with you or whatever. Hey, it wouldn't be cool if there was this. It's like, yeah, that might be cool. But even before execution, it's like, well, maybe setting the table for execution, you have to like, what's better to do that or create a problem statement with a tight solution space saying, hey, here's a problem we actually have right now that we're willing to solve. And now you create a community where the people can innovate around that. It's not just like, oh, I was having a beer or I was, going to sleep and I just thought, oh, wouldn't it be cool if this is like something people are willing to pay for right now? And how do you innovate around that? And that's why I think the problem we're solving right now with co-creation.
Absolutely.
Well, it looks great. It sounds great. I mean, co-creation sounds flawless to me. It sounds like there's nothing wrong.
Super easy.
And,
any company could just right now.
Today. So downsides come into the fact that sometimes, and this goes back to what Chris was saying on noise versus signal, right? If you don't have a strong enough evaluation criteria, you're dealing with much more noise. You're not able to filter out to get to signal. In addition to that, when you're dealing with large crowds, you're always going to have, as the kids like to say, you're going to have the haters who are there to do nothing but be disruptive. Now, I have a lot of ideas with regards to how to mediate that, but usually that if you have a robust community that has a unique collective vision who appreciates the same things, it usually kind of self-polices, and it's not so much something that the community manager, which is what my old job was, because other people care enough for the platform that they've been given to say, hey man, like chill out with that. You're not being very productive with your rhetoric, and all you're doing is causing problems. We like it here. It's like when you live in a nice neighborhood, aside from an HOA where it's imposed by fiat. But if you have a nice neighborhood where you appreciate and know your neighbors, right? When one neighbor's landscaping kind of gets out of hand, you can go to that neighbor and be like, hey man, we really like living here. We all enjoy the look and feel of our neighborhood, and we know each other. We care about each other. And so if you need help, we'll help you, right? That's what a good, robust co-creation community reminds me of, is that really open neighborly type of interaction. Now, another downside is when working with large companies, agreeing to various different type of legal terms can be a bit of a bear because they deal with different regulatory frameworks than usually you do with the co-creation community. Now, it's not insurmountable, but it is labor intensive. So even before the community sees certain aspects of co-creation, there is that to contend with. The way I see it is if it's templatized, you now have a framework you can do as a jump off point. You're not going from 0 to 1, which is always the hardest step, right? And so there are ways of mitigation that not only did we discover in the time that, me and Chris and some of our other former colleagues, right, spent in co-creation at Local Motors, but since Local Motors, we've seen the rise of other types of interaction online that allow us to have frameworks for templates of these things that didn't exist in the early stages of co-creation. So
could I jump in here at that moment? When you say templatizing, could you also say that this is something to do with governance or structure or the organization of it? Do you think that it could be broader than templatizing, or do you think that it's just simply templates are needed and that's it?
I would say that at all levels of co-creation, there needs to be some sort of framework that you can reference, even if you don't leverage. What I mean by that is, you brought up governance, right? Having a framework for governance means that you know where to get started and you're not starting from 0 to where it's a bear of an effort every single time. Maybe that template that you're starting from doesn't work. That's okay. You at least understand the constraints of said template to recreate a different framework from that initial framework.
So right? There's probably like an ethos even, right? Like almost like values, for the company and the community. There's probably, I don't know, I just think of branding, right? It's like you have values, you have if you're doing it right, honest values that you actually fight for, personality traits, almost like a culture, right? Like how do we interact with each other? How do we treat each other?
Sure.
Values. And then you get to like brand story, which is like, what types of problems are we trying to solve here in this community? And does this fit, into that? And then, going back to the company concerns, like, well, how do we negotiate with this community and say, like, what kinds of things do we normally, give the community? What does the ignition kit normally look like? What kind of legal constraints do we want to place on this? And will it be overbearing or will it not be? And then how do you kind of fine tune that? And it seems like if you were to stand up, and I guess for some reason, Black Rifle Coffee Company comes to mind, right? Because it has a loyal following, right?
Absolutely.
And it's fun, right? And so if you were to create a community like that, it would be very different, and it would probably require any company that wants to start their own community. It's probably a little bit of a learning process there too, but I don't think that it's hard forever, right? Because you're still showing people, how do we act here, right?
Right.
And then that starts to become, I think a lot of that becomes like, hey, we're learning lessons. That was maybe too much of a constraint in our community for that challenge or whatever, this legal constraint. How do we back that off, right? Things like that.
Right.
Because you're going to learn how to. Now, did we make some mistakes at Local Motors in that area and how we treated the community and how we enabled them? And what did we learn when we were there? Anything come to mind?
So there was never one specific challenge or initiative that we ran that I would say was perfect. So I would say mistakes were made all the time, but when you're doing new things, you're going to discover new ways of being wrong.
Yep.
And we did that a lot. But it was for the sake of being better every time. You know what I mean?
It's innovation, right? I mean,
it is. But not only that is that's not to say we didn't do things right or that we didn't, move the needle on a lot of different things that we did, even things that had no real product desired outcome. Even when we were just like, we're doing a challenge right now to test your skills community to see who's the king of the hill, who's out there with the coolest ideas for, said race car. Like, show us something, and it's something that they love because it's race car. There's a lot of enthusiasm around that world. And usually what we would do is we prime the pump with something that was a little bit more fun and less, product driven, only to set you up for, and now we're going to run the real challenge. The real challenge is we are actually going to do this sports car thing, as an example, right? So we learned that by doing that, what it did is it got the gears turning in this thing with so many cogs and gears when you have a large body community. But it initiated that machine to start moving and generating, let's say, torque. So that way, when you needed to apply torque to the work could take place very quickly, and you're able to get a stream of ideas thick and fast.
So did Local Motors actually know what the problem was before they opened the community challenge, or sometimes did they find out what the problem was as they went along?
We'd like to think we did, but to your point, Oliver, in the nature of how you asked the question, it's a really good observation to know that sometimes you don't know all of the problem right off the bat. And what would happen there is we would have these various different sessions with the community, whether they be live or we would just start to pick it up through the chat of what was happening online and say, oh, there's some ambiguity in this brief that the community called out before we did. And they're actually bringing some really good information to the table with regards to gaps in our own understanding and research. We need to backfill. And then we would redo the brief. And this happened a few times where we would go, hey, community, you're right. You guys called out some really good points. You have some deeper perspective in some of these things. We will adjust the brief. Make sure that everyone knows we're now operating on brief version 1.4 or something like that. Now, that wasn't often because when working with other companies, usually they're bringing a pretty well-defined problem statement to us, whereas some of the ones that we did for ourselves, we were willing to be more open to learn and develop that problem statement and thus the creative brief through those back and forth online processes.
Yeah, like co-creating the brief with the community before you ever co-create a product.
Absolutely.
They're going to see around corners that we're not seeing.
So a good example would be the urban mobility project that we did with Berlin 2030 was the idea, right? We were doing all this research on what is mobility going to look like in the future with regards to automation, electrification, and all that stuff. And we were doing this in 2015, right? So EVs weren't even a part of the main conversation in mobility quite yet. They had been introduced, but they weren't mainstream.
And urban mobility, Nemo, just being like, okay, how do you set up a city in such a way that supports large populations and getting people around without clogging up the streets, without a bunch of privately owned vehicles taking most of the burden? Is that a good?
I mean, simply put, is trying to rebuild our cities for people and not cars, right? And in American cities, that's still a pretty major issue, and it's a massive talking point with regard to mobility in North America. In Europe, they were willing to adapt that conversation much earlier on, which is why we picked Berlin as a good example for that specific challenge. Even in 2015, their public transportation, bike infrastructure, things like that, alternative mobility was already pretty good, right? So using them as kind of the, let's say, the poster child for the things, the ways we wanted to think. But what other problems does Berlin have that could still be solved to make this even better? What I think was a really, really good choice. But we came to that via conversations during the research phase with the community. We put out a sub challenge, an early thing that said, where are you from? What are the mobility challenges of your part of the world that you think need to be solved? and it was really compelling. Hearing things from people from Singapore, from India. We even had some Central Sub-Saharan African people in our community that had some really, really interesting sort of early infrastructure development challenges that were really, really interesting. Of course, North America, but South America as well. So a full global perspective before we even had our problem statement and creative brief to run the challenge. And it was extremely eye-opening as to what we could cross-reference that we all experience, and then what are the unique problems in various different areas. It was really, really cool.
Just going to jump in with a quick question, if you don't mind, Nemo. I was just wondering, there's a lot of
Sure.
good ideas here, but obviously some good ideas wouldn't have been selected. What happened to those good ideas that were not selected?
It depends on the way the terms and conditions were written based on who we were working with, because there were different regulatory frameworks we had to account for. I'll give you an example of one that I think went really well is when we worked with Grant Imahara from Mythbusters, and we were working with Mauser Electronics and NXP. That one was really fun because the idea was around a product that we had already brought to the table, which is the world's first 3D printed car called the Strati. But what we were doing was outfitting the Strati for various different cool ideas that could be to make the Strati autonomous, but then how can we make this a really cool personal mobility device? We got some great stuff. And the one that won was a guy deploying a drone from the back, and he called it the fly mode, where the drone would pop off of this little back area and just launch up, and then it would show you like where's traffic, right? And then it would feed that information into the map system to get a better routing plan, right? Or you could use it for sightseeing while you're driving autonomously and you're just looking at your screen, seeing around you the really, really cool sights if you're in a nice, cool mountain road. So there's all these different really cool functions. However, there were some really interesting ones within there where you turned your personal mobility system into like something for exercise. There would be these like elastic bands, you could start doing rows and stuff like that. And then, super, super novel, a little bit harder to execute. As far as a practicality question, there is still some things to work out. The idea was sound, right? In the terms and conditions of that one, since Mauser had no claim to IP, NXP had no claim to IP, they were there to provide components to execute the ideas, right? So since they had no claim to IP, we put in a clause that I think it was like a 3-month gardening period, where the ideas were there for us to be optioned first right to refusal, whether they won or not. And then, of course, there would be a cash prize allotted to that based on the value of the innovation. But we still gave first, second, and third prize money, right? And the IP agreement was if you accept the prize money, then the IP belongs to Local Motors.
Yeah,
so that's an example of a framework of how we did that.
But do they just disappear then after that 3-month period? Like they just go back?
There's been entire companies that came from people who didn't win challenges that took their innovations elsewhere.
Oh, so they take the information elsewhere and then they still use
it. It belonged to them.
Right.
Yep.
Okay. So nothing got wasted.
First right of refusal. I mean, that's what.
Yeah. Once it was past the gardening.
Right.
Correct. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, sometimes for instance, in the DOE challenge that we did with regard to advanced materials for lightweighting or manufacturing, different manufacturing methods for lightweighting, that gardening period was a much longer period of time, unless the person who wanted to, if they didn't win, right, wanted to take their innovation to like a manufacturing company, said, I figured out a problem for you. They could get written permission to do that from the DOE as per the T's and C's of that specific challenge, right? So the gardening leave or the non-compete, if you want to call it that, I don't remember. We had specific legal terms. I'm not a lawyer, so I don't remember. But I'm using terms I think we can all understand. I want to say it was like 6 months. Don't quote me. It's been a long time. But the thing was there were a few people that had some really, really great ideas that were like, through the connections they made in the co-creation process had the opportunity to take those ideas to other materials suppliers or manufacturers and stuff like that, and turn it into their own opportunities, right?
So how did local motors feel about that? Creating an environment where other organizations are benefiting from ideas which they didn't perhaps use. How did they feel about doing all this work, if you like, for someone else without being paid for it?
What exactly, the way I think I framed it, and I can't speak for anyone else, so I'll speak for myself. What exactly is the downside of being a platform that raises other people to levels of success they might not have seen otherwise? Regardless of whether or not Local Motors benefits from that or not, all it does is proves the model of co-creation. And that means we could still derive value from ideas for our own means, as well as everybody else has the opportunity to do that as well.
Did they feel that way?
Said it best. Yes, Jay Rogers said on a number of occasions when he knew other people were getting publicly, by the way, you can find him online quoted as saying such, is a rising tide raises all ships, right? Now, coming from the military, and using kind of maritime language is second nature to Jay, but it made total sense in the idea that he wasn't just out to benefit himself and his own initiatives by creating co-creation. It's actually in his original thesis that's not the point. The point is to give people access to networks and the ability to achieve new and fresh ideas, even outside of what the person running the challenge initially wanted. Right,
but
obviously,
for other
what you were
people
saying
to
earlier about friend DA, NDA, and having these ideas which are open
friend
to
DA,
anyone to use. It's kind of like you're touching on something like the common good, over factionalized interests. The benefit of the collective, the rising tide carries all ships. It seems a very similar sort of concept here. Just thought I'd mention that. Just seems to tie
absolutely.
It paid off for Local Motors.
It did. It did for many years, and with a lot of relationships that even as Local Motors dispersed, they weren't able to ride out COVID as well as they'd hoped. And,
but it wasn't because of co-creation. It wasn't because it wasn't successful.
No. And the thing that I would say made co-creation die was not keeping up with other aspects that could have made co-creation thrive, right? So as new technologies, like in the early part of co-creation, social media existed. It just wasn't as prolific as it became. And by not integrating social media into the process as a part of the function of co-creation, the social part, let's say, they weren't able to leverage the power that social media. They created a situation where social media was a marketing tool, a marketing arm, and co-creation was a marketing / product development arm. And the two never found a place to meet. As podcasts became way more consumed in the mid 20 teens into the late 20 teens, and you're starting to see just record numbers of podcasts come out and record numbers of podcasts being listened to. Local Motors was primed to talk about the things they were doing as a podcast, and by the time they had considered that even as an option, it was already too late. You know what I mean? And so there's a lot of integration efforts that they didn't really do that could have kept them at the forefront as there's these social and technological transitions. I'm sorry,
we had
Chris,
so much content to share. I mean,
so much.
When I was leaving, I was writing a schedule for the podcast to talk with people who were former participants, winners, and even recorded a couple. But yeah,
and we didn't really get the opportunity to execute. I mean, we were so stretched thin as a team. The engineers were the community managers, designers were the community managers. So not only are we working on executing on our products and making sure to meet those schedules and timelines, we're still making content and we're still interacting with people, leaving comments and trying to give feedback and critique so those people's entries and ideas could be fleshed out in that manner. So yeah, we were stretched thin. So the idea of these other content generation strategies seemed daunting legitimately. It wasn't that anyone was being lazy or anything like that. It was just like, oh man, one more thing to throw on my already over full plate. You know, it's like an American when they go to Sizzler buffet. You know? Too many things.
This is what strikes me in this conversation, is that you had engineers doing community, engineers trying to do governance, engineers and makers also trying to do stewardship, and all these aspects of community. Which I'm a community builder, so it's a full-time job,
sure.
And just like engineering is a full-time job, and just like marketing is as well, community is its own discipline. Right. And the more I listen to...
Such, yeah.
Sorry?
Well, I was just going to say, and to build to what you're saying, and as such, and going and answering your question in a slightly different way, is that because all of those things are a full-time job, and you have people with full-time regular jobs aside from the co-creation efforts trying to manage those things, as you can imagine, certain things just slip through the cracks, including integration of better tools that were existing that could have made their jobs easier. Like I think, Oliver, you and I talked about with your background in crypto, had we executed on our ability to track and pay royalties through some sort of blockchain sort of mechanism, through tokenization and smart contracts, had we executed on something like that, and that was implemented and automated through those type of mechanisms, there were a lot of co-creation community members with so much value to add that would have still participated and kept the health of the community. Right?
That's just we needed to do that.
That's a perfect example.
We knew we needed to. We were talking about it before. I mean, it's just like, when it's where do you focus? And sometimes you don't know where to put your resources. I think what we're doing now with the three of us is we're zooming out a little bit, and we're saying like, hey, we understand the dynamics. We also understand that there needs to be that relationship between the brand and the community. Well, say you have your own community. A company wants to stand up their own community. There's a relationship between that brand and that community, and that relationship needs to be based on trust, which is something that is near and dear to my heart, because there are a lot of, my branding background, but not that there needs to be that authenticity, and it can't just be any way of branding. There's two big ways of creating a good brand. One of them is like, pay a bunch of money to a consultant and they'll put you in front of the parade and act like you were leading it the whole time, right? Totally just sleazy, crappy. What do people want to hear? I'm just going to tell them. It doesn't matter what our values are. But the other kind tends to build those relationships. It builds community, because the brand cares about, much like a company that says our employees are really important. We hire good people, and then we treat them really well, and they treat our customers well. Well, the same dynamic applies in a co-creation environment, because you have to have a brand that's willing to say we're going to create this community, but we're genuinely going to invest in them, and it's going to be about the community, because that's the goose that lays the golden eggs, right? We're not trying to monetize it every chance we get and sell it out. What we're trying to do is create a community
you're not
where people
wringing
feel
the rag
respected.
Out constantly.
Exactly. Where people start feeling used a little bit. They start questioning your motives. And
they will be vocal about it.
Which is
if you have a good community,
good
you want that. Yeah,
if you care. That. And if you're willing to say, hey, we're
absolutely
keeping short accounts. We're willing to deal with things as they come. We're not just going to pretend it's not happening forever, right?
Yeah.
So you have to have an attitude. I think that's part of our zooming out, is our ability to see that. Oliver, you're a community manager. You have a broader view than we do, and in a lot of areas, because you're a community manager. You're looking at this holistically. Nemo and I have a sense of that. You have the experience in it, and that's really important. We need to be able to zoom out and say, hey, what are the human things that make this work? Because that's the real leverage, and that's what a lot of companies they just don't have it quite yet in their DNA, or they need to be taught, or and they need these processes to organize. Because you can't just say, we respect our community. You actually have to have processes You have to know, like, hey, here's how we're going to do it, because we're willing to put our money where our mouth is a little bit, but it's going to yield such good results.
Yeah, exactly. I do have this because I never worked in co-creation to the extent that you guys did, and I see co-creation as being very specialist. It's incredibly important because companies often live and die by the strength of the products they create, and the idea of harnessing the collective to make something incredible resonates with me. Obviously, as a community builder, I do believe in the power of the collective. And when I heard about co-creation for the first time, when I met you guys a few months ago now, I was thinking to myself, this is absolutely incredible. It's actually a missing piece that I was not seeing. Obviously, working in crypto, we do have that too. We work on apps, developers, core developers work with token holders and other developers. And there is that kind of co-creation, if you like, but we never called it that. And it seems to be a term which is very specific to the automation community, but I think it can apply to absolutely any organization making anything. That's one thing that hit me. And then the other thing that hit me is that it seems almost as if co-creation is trying to do too much the way that you were doing it, and everyone's trying to do everything. And I completely agree with your point, Nemo, earlier about templatizing it, because there needs to be some kind of structure to it. And then your other point about the economic continuity angle, you knew you had to get these guys some money somehow in order for them to come back. I hope I'm paraphrasing that right, but that basically is a continuity issue, and it's something which is a downstream effect of getting the right structure in place at the beginning. If there's something not working at the top in terms of how the payments are made, or even if it's a priority or not, then obviously later on, it's just not going to continue. And I'd be very interested in digging. Sorry, go ahead.
To add to that, because you bring up a really good point, is in the chase of that financial continuity, as you put it, what winds up happening is that we're halfway through one co-creation effort at a key stage of execution, and we're already moving on to the next thing, trying to figure out the sales pitch on the next co-creation initiative, which means that we're now even more strapped for resources. In the case of local motors, right? We were even more strapped for resources with execution of the previous thing that we had already started, right? And in some cases, we were, I would say, ill-equipped but experienced enough to still execute. And other times it made us get caught with our pants down as to, like, hey, you guys are dropping the ball. Like, where are you at on some of these things that need attention? You seem like you're distracted by the next shiny object. And so we had the shiny object syndrome, right? But the shiny object syndrome was a byproduct of that thing that you mentioned with the financial continuity. We needed to sell the co-creation efforts, or sell the next white label for co-creation efforts, in order to sustain the ability to do co-creation, right? And so, and as such, it was very. It caused a slight decay, not only in like morale, because now the people who are left to execute feel like they don't have any resources to do so, right? And so there's the decay of morale, but there was also a decay of, you're constantly trying to strip off what you think is the fat, right? And sometimes when you're throwing cargo overboard to try to save the ship, you're getting rid of provisions, and you die of starvation, not because the ship sank, right?
But
and so yeah, go ahead.
Well, but that was unique to local motors, because what we're trying to do is we had to be very opportunistic at launch forth, is what we called it, right? In the end,
right.
And so we were just like, hey, NASA wants to do this. We can't tell them, like, well, we have a slot available next quarter, right? We're just like, no, we need to like start thinking about this now. With a company that creates their own co-creation community, like GE, they're able to schedule those things out. And so when you schedule stuff out, it's like content strategy, right? You schedule your content out. It's not a stressor, right?
And I would argue that's why FirstBuild was so much more stable as a co-creation community.
And FirstBuild is GE's co-creation community, for those out there.
Correct.
FirstBuild.
Yeah. Which I think, to your point, is they had those organizational structures from a stable company that disciplined this more upstart kind of wing of that company, whereas we were still trying to figure it all out. We didn't have that stable structure and discipline up front. We were figuring that out, and we had too many voices trying to tell us the best way to go about it. And there was value to some of all those different community departments or internal departments, right? But there was no cohesion between those values.
Yeah, a lack of structure for sure. And I think we could have done a much better job, I think, too, if we always knew where we were going and you had an operational backbone. I think that was a weakness of Local Motors for sure. That's why personally I ended up getting into operations, because I was around so many ideas that it was like, wait, to sustain this though, we have to have an operational backbone. We have to have a plan to do everything we say we're going to do. And we can't think about it the day before the deadline. Like, you can do that in college, right? You can't do that with creating content. You can't do that with a community, because it loses trust. Clients, community members, they don't know that you're stressed. They just think they're being ignored and disrespected, and that you're using them. And it can just look like, it can look bad when you're not organized. You have the best intentions, but you're just not organized. And I think that we just lack that. And I think
you could say, okay, so I'll just jump in here, because you mentioned organization twice, and how you're you could have done it better and all that, and we made mistakes, and it would be better if we did it again. But if you look around, correct me if I'm wrong, but co-creation isn't being done by anyone. So I think it might be just deeper than we could have done it better next time, because nobody's, as far as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, but nobody's actually picked up the mantle and running with co-creation right now. Is that right?
I have a theory.
Go ahead, Chris. Go ahead.
My theory is,
I have a feeling you're going to say the same thing that I might be thinking. So
all right, let's see. So my theory is that that when you're concerned, you have innovators, and this is what happened at Local Motors. You had innovators who had a lot of ideas, and tends to be with innovators. EOS talks about this, right? The innovator integrator model, right? Where the innovator is the visionary. The visionary is the one who has all the ideas, and the ideas change potentially week to week. But then you have that integrator who is actually the implementer of all the ideas, but they have a budget, and they're constrained to reality, and they want to get the first thing across the finish line before we have the next idea. So there's discipline that's introduced in that process. If you have a organization that's too focused on execution and just discipline, then you don't get innovation. Even an organization that's too focused, or a culture too focused on innovation, then if you don't have enough, if they don't give credit to execution and say, hey, but we need to listen to our executors, well, then you just have a bunch of ideas, and nobody knows how to execute or how to follow. Nobody can follow it.
What I see is that the functional aspects of how it was presented, how the community would have saw co-creation happen, those things shattered, right? So you still have online competitions, right? You still have online collaborative environments and all different types of, like, you got design ones, you have engineering ones. These things still exist, but they don't exist as a cohesive framework like co-creation was for Local Motors. And I would argue that Local Motors was fleshing out, and it was striking the hot iron during that entire time, and never fully made a knife. You know what I mean? And so we had all the seeds planted in there, and we never got to full formation. But the thing is the value of the things that we did has informed how people do compartmentalized versions of those things. When you look at the way that Discord has grown as a way for people to collaborate and interact with each other on a social level, it took a little bit from social media, but it also, you could see some echoes to things that we did at Local Motors. Now, whether it's derived from Local Motors, I don't know. I'm willing to bet probably not. But my point is this: the seeds of what we did at Local Motors exist in other places like that, but it's a component of and not a cohesive full machine.
So right? It is being done.
Same with Patreon. Patreon is the same thing, where people pay to interact and watch people do the thing that they're good at, right? You could do that in Local Motors and watch people build their projects, but you got to do it for free. Patreon just monetized that section of it, that part of the community. And now everybody kind of copied the Patreon model, right?
I suppose really what I'm getting down to is like, why has that happened? Why has that compartmentalization happened as a general trend? Why is nobody stepping in and trying to put it all together? And what are they missing?
And I'm glad you bring that up, because that was the part that I wanted to close with. I forgot to close with it. It's because it's easier to refine and execute on a component than it is the whole system. And that's what all these different sections that are echoes of things that happened at Local Motors. That's why all these things have become as prolific as they have been, because they took the component and they said, I'm going to hyper focus on this specific feature and I'm going to execute on it. And they've done quite well. We didn't do that. We had a massive system with so many different components, and we didn't hyper focus enough to get even one of those components to function, because the strength of the system was the stability of those individual components. So we're constantly playing whack-a-mole.
I just jump in here, sorry. Would you then agree with me that co-creation as a category was too broad, that it needed to be broken down into separate compartments in order for it to be a coherent whole?
I would say in the time of working at Local Motors, no. In my more mature, doing more research and building some of the frameworks based on everything that I learned, I would absolutely say yes.
Can I say that a different way and see if I'm understanding you guys correctly? So, like with a GE, I think the reason that they might have had a lot of reasons for us to create their platform rather than them using our platform. But they also were a lot more focused on manufacturing types of things GE makes. Is that exactly what we're talking about?
Specifically, GE appliances when they launched FirstBuild.
Right, in Louisville, right.
Right.
So it's a lot more practical for a company rather than to create this whole co-creation, all comers, any clients come in. We're basically like a little bit of like a marketing agency, almost like for people to come in and give us their challenges. Instead, it makes a little more sense for a company to say, this is the kind of thing we do. We really want people in firearms development or something like that. To show up, to be a part of our community long term. Engineers, designers, users of.
So this is part of the formula that we never quite got to a crystallized form of at Local Motors, was community plus industry plus problem equals a fertile ground for co-creation. I'm kind of riffing. I still don't know that we have a perfect Boolean for said things. But the thing is I think we have a better understanding of where the downfalls were, where certain variables that we were trying to take on were completely unnecessary and a waste of time, and other variables that would have been a part of that equation were way more important, that did not get the resources and attention that they deserved. And I think we know that now with the benefit of hindsight.
Yeah, well, because we can say now, looking back, right, that the components exist. Have you guys ever read Tribes by Seth Godin?
Not yet. It's on my list. I got to do it.
It's like, Deadheads is one of the examples he uses in Tribes. It's this community that just really cares about. Now, I'm not a deadhead. I don't like hippies that much. But the point is,
anyone who's going to listen to this, he's talking about Swifties, but of a different era.
Yeah, okay, there you go, Swifties, right? And so, do they contribute to the community, to the cultural well-being? I don't know about that, but the point is that these communities exist, and people are fans of brands. We know that.
Absolutely.
We know there are a lot of people with frustrations out there about products. We talked about Jeep before, Oliver, I think, where you could talk to people in the 4x off-road community. You can get them, you could organize that. And that's not rocket science. It's not like not everyone can do it, but it's not something that hasn't been done before.
Well, you can't, like, there's a Tenacious D quote I'm going to kind of butcher here, but it was when they had their HBO TV show, and Jack Black was like, you can't manufacture Inspirato. You can't zippity-doo-dah Inspirato.
Right.
It comes from a quietness is still... But what he's saying does have, like some real functional meaning, in that the idea is, like, with community, you can't manufacture a community. There needs to be some sort of organic kind of initial grassroots aspect of it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You see, like, for instance, you brought up Jeep. No one started the duck thing. It just became a joke that bloomed into a meme, that bloomed into a full-on phenomenon. And now it's like, if you see a Jeep without ducks, you're like, kind of feel bad for the guy, even if you think the whole process is obnoxious.
When I was
had to do its own thing.
When I was driving my Jeep, and there were people with new Jeeps, you do the Jeep wave. People with new Jeeps, they had no idea what was going on. People with the old classic Jeeps with ducks, they'd be like, they do the wave back, right?
Well, or the Miata community, where you flash your pop-up headlights to like wink at the other guy. Yeah, like, that's a thing, right?
Yeah.
The motorcycle wave for bikers. Like, these things happened naturally.
We're not
We've got 8 minutes left,
capturing.
guys. We've got 8 minutes left, so I'm going to have to ask you 2 questions. I need to get through my list. Sorry. So I know the Jeep stuff is very cool. Just very quickly, just have to ask you about... You mentioned earlier there's the founder of Local Motors, who was kind of like as far as I understand, he was the progenitor behind the idea, and he had some beliefs, some ideas, which I think earlier in the conversation you agreed with, that the rising tide brings up all the boats, things like this. I just have one quick question about that, and then a second one to finish, actually, just so that we can conclude just on time, because I know, Chris, you've got to go somewhere. But the question I had was really this idea of him believing this idea of a rising tide raising all boats. Do you believe that was a belief that was shared by people in the community as well? Do you believe that was a belief that co-creation as an idea was accepted, or do you think that people had factionalized interests and that this conflicted with his belief in some way and caused any tensions that caused co-creation to have problems later? What I'm trying to get at here is to do really with the common good.
Sure.
Was everyone trying to make faster vehicles, design better, innovate better, provide better contributor opportunity, or was it factionalized? Was everybody working for their own factionalized interests, and it somehow worked anyway? A little bit like capitalism.
No, you're taking it by the nature of how you're framing the question. You're taking it exactly where I was thinking, because what I would say in the shortest answer is, if you ask the individual in the co-creation community, right, a rising tide raises all ships, yes or no? They're going to be like, well, no. Because that individual is only going to be focused on, in the midst of that question, their own specific desires and potential outcomes. But when you ask groups of shared, like-minded people, right, you get a more sense of collective good, in that they do want the rising tide to raise all ships, because they do have a bit more shared goals and stuff like that.
So
now here's the thing. That can work in a positive way, right? Rising tide raises all ships. But as we know, crowds can also very easily create to mass psychosis and or fear. And it's no different with online communities. Right? If one person says, hey, this voting strategy, which was a thing we actually dealt with, is unfair, and it's a potential hazard to how the community feels in confidence of voting, well, now all of a sudden that fear becomes almost an irrational fear amongst the group. Whereas if you ask the individual, they're like, it's really not that big a deal, and it's not that far off from what I feel to be is fair, right? So you have this sort of like collective opinion versus individual opinion on both positive and negative.
I think it's
Okay, just on that point, just to follow up very quickly, and then Chris, you'll have the last word. But would you then agree that the person's private self-interest should always be subordinate to the group's, in no matter when it comes up as a rule for co-creation?
I don't know if that's something that you need to regulate or impose by fiat. I think it happens organically. We are tribal people. We are social people, and I think it's something I said to you in the past, Oliver, is that we're social creatures. So the idea of design in a vacuum or people being individualistic with their ability to execute ideas, it's not possible, right? We need other people. And so the idea of like design in a vacuum always kind of pissed me off, because no one person can execute all things. You do things as collectives. And so organically, the individual's personal desires are subordinate to the group's just by nature of how we all have to participate in the human condition.
In the community.
So, yeah.
Chris, go for it.
Go ahead.
I know you wanted to jump in. Please have the last word.
Yeah, briefly. I think it's like capitalism a little bit. It's like everybody has their own self-interest, but the right kind of co-creation community is going to make them stoked to be a part of it.
I like that.
Yeah, that's a great way to finish.
Thank
you very much, guys.
And I like that because I'm stoked to be a part of it, and that's the reason why I've carried the candle on this ever since 2020 when I was no longer involved with Local Motors. I've still been very passionate about the idea that co-creation is a power and force for good.